Well, there weren't gang wars, but there were beefs and there were battles about position and who should cross the line into where we lived. And
in the final years of his life, Frank Sinatra revealed a truth he had carried for decades, one tied to the sudden and heartbreaking demise of Elvis Presley. Their relationship had been marked by rivalry, respect, and tension, but what Sinatra revealed before his own passing shocked those who heard it. This was no ordinary reflection. It was a rare and haunting admission from a man who had once stood in the same spotlight. Join us as we unravel Sinatra's word and its influence on how the world remembered Elvis. Rock and roll rises. A new wave was crashing in on America, and it came with sounds that were raw, restless, and loud. By the late 1950s, the music was being shaken up in ways that no one could ignore. Radios across the country blasted rhythms that felt different from anything before. The smooth and polished traditions of jazz and swing were being pushed aside, drowned out by guitars that screamed and singers who came from the South with voices that carried heat and grit. Rock and roll had arrived, and it spread fast, filling the air with an energy that unsettled the older crowd. Among those who stood for the old guard was Frank Sinatra. For more than a decade, Sinatra had ruled the stage, the radio, and the screen. His voice was smooth and magnetic, carrying songs with effortless charm. His looks, his confidence, and the way he carried himself made him more than a singer. He was a symbol of style and sophistication, someone who could walk into any room and own it. Through the 1940s and early 1950s, he played to sold-out shows, acted in films that kept his name in lights, and earned the respect of critics and audiences alike. He moved in powerful circles, brushed shoulders with mob figures and presidents, and built an image of elegance that few could rival. He was polished, refined, and widely admired. It was so until 1956, when everything shifted. Out of nowhere, Elvis Presley exploded into the spotlight. His rise was sudden, and it carried a force that seemed impossible to contain. He stepped onto the stage with slicked back hair, a lip that curled with attitude, and hips that swung in ways America had never seen. His performances carried an energy that stirred up teenagers and provoked their parents. He was not just another singer delivering tunes. He was a spark, setting off reactions wherever he went. Teenagers followed him as if he had cast a spell. Parents frowned, unable to understand what their children were drawn to. Church groups condemned his movements, calling them indecent. Yet the numbers told the truth. His records flew off shelves by the millions. His name filled headlines. His face was on posters, magazines, and television screens. By 1957, he was not rising anymore. He was at the top, dominating the charts and reshaping what it meant to be a star. The contrast between Elvis and Sinatra was hard to miss. Sinatra crooned with grace, wearing tuxedos and standing with perfect poise. His songs came out smooth and filled with vibes. Elvis, on the other hand, growled with raw passion. He wore flashy outfits, clothes that glittered under the lights. His style pulled from gospel, blues, and rockabilly, and it shook audiences to their core. It felt as if a torch was being passed from one generation to the next, though not everyone was ready for it. The press picked up the contrast and began to frame it as a cultural clash. Newspapers and magazines painted the picture of a battle. On one side was Sinatra, the long-standing king of swing and sophistication. On the other side was Presley, the new king of rock and roll. Headlines stirred gossip and commentators fanned the flames. The media loved to push the idea of rivalry, making it about more than music. It became about identity, about values, about where America was headed. Younger fans clung to Elvis as a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and change. They saw him as fresh and unrestrained, someone who spoke to their spirit. Older fans, however, held on to Sinatra as a symbol of class and artistry. To them, Sinatra represented control, tradition, and a sense of culture that was being swept away too fast. This divide turned the music scene into a battleground of generations. Behind the scenes, the industry was changing just as quickly. Record executives who had built their empires on big bands and polished vocalists began chasing younger acts with guitars. Radio stations switched formats, dropping old styles for the wild sound of rock and roll. Nightclubs rebranded to keep up with the energy of youth, bringing in new crowds who wanted noise, movement, and excitement. The industry was shifting its weight, and Elvis stood at the center of it all. This transformation built a strong sense of tension. Fans wondered how Sinatra would react to this new star taking over. Musicians whispered about what it meant for the old styles they had built careers on. The public speculated about Sinatra's feelings, whether he felt threatened, frustrated, or simply entertained by it all. Never before had someone risen so quickly and taken such a firm grip on culture. Even Sinatra's meteoric rise in the 1940s had not carried this kind of storm. What began as two artists working in very different styles now started to look like a collision between past and future. Sinatra, with all his achievements and his unmatched reputation, began to appear like a man rooted in another time. Elvis, with his energy and rawness, looked like the face of what was still to come. He was only at the beginning of his journey, and each performance, each new fan, and each record sold seemed to add more fuel to the fire. The stage was set for an era where the old ways and the new would clash. One represented tradition, grace, and order. The other represented youth, rebellion, and the unpredictable force of change. Sinatra had already secured his place as a legend, but Elvis was pulling the culture in a new direction, one that no one could stop. The late 1950s had become a turning point, and with Sinatra and Elvis standing on opposite ends, the world was watching which way it would turn. Clash of cultures, Elvis Presley rose through American culture like a storm, and his sudden rise pulled attention from everyone, including Frank Sinatra, and people waited to see how he would react to this new star shaking up the industry. By 1957, the answer came, and it came sharply. In a piece written for a French magazine, Sinatra laid out his feelings with strong words that could not in any way be mistaken. He described the new sound of rock and roll in the harshest terms, portraying it as rough, vulgar, and unpleasant. He went further by calling it something that smelled bad and stirred unhealthy feelings, created by people who had no discipline or real training in music. Sinatra did not mention Elvis directly, but the meaning hung in the air. Elvis was, at that time, the face of rock and roll, and everyone connected the remarks to him. The comments exploded across the entertainment world. They were not simple criticism of a style. They cut deeply because they seemed aimed at the young singer who was winning the hearts of millions. Fans of Elvis felt hurt, as though their love for music had been dismissed by an older figure who could not accept change. To some, it looked like envy hidden under words of superiority. To others, it felt like a man who had ruled the stage for years, striking out because he saw the ground shifting beneath him. The press wasted no time in stirring up the drama. Headlines suggested Sinatra felt threatened not just by a new style of music, but by the growing power of Elvis himself. Gossip columns fed the idea of rivalry, and the public began to picture the two as locked in a battle. Sinatra stood for tradition, refinement, and control, while Elvis represented raw energy, rebellion, and youth breaking through barriers. The clash of styles told its own story. Sinatra's measured, careful lilting stood far apart from Elvis's wild moves and electrifying voice. For more than a decade, Sinatra had helped shape what the nation listened to, and he carried influence that stretched far beyond the stage. Suddenly, a 22-year-old from Tupelo had grabbed the spotlight and taken hold of the culture. Many older figures in music saw this change as dangerous, even destructive, and Sinatra's words gave voice to their fears. At the time, many adults felt uneasy about rock and roll. The sound was loud, the rhythm was forceful, and the image carried rebellion that troubled those who had built a peaceful post-war society. Elvis became the symbol of that rebellion, and the anger directed at him often came from people who simply could not understand the wave of youth culture rising around them. Sinatra's attack reflected that larger mood. His opinion was not only his own, but echoed the concerns of many. Still, the impact of his remarks stuck. People saw it as proof that a feud existed, even though the two men had never openly traded words in public. Fans turned it into a story of opposition, old against new, classic against daring, control against freedom. Elvis embodied change, while Sinatra embodied the establishment. The stage felt set for a lasting divide. Yet time moved forward, and by 1960 the landscape had changed. Rock and roll did not fade away as some had predicted. Instead, it grew into the new standard, and Elvis returned from military service to find his place unoccupied. His popularity held firm, and his image grew even stronger. Sinatra still carried weight in music and entertainment, but the tide was clearly not in his favor. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of keeping distance, Sinatra invited Elvis to join him on a television special. The event became one of the most talked-about broadcasts of the era. The program, titled "Welcome Home, Elvis," aired in May of 1960 and celebrated Elvis's return from the Army. Viewers were stunned to see both stars standing together on the same stage. The show offered scenes that seemed to heal years of tension. Sinatra and Elvis laughed together, stood side by side, and even sang each other's songs. Sinatra performed Elvis's ballad "Love Me Tender," while Elvis returned the gesture with Sinatra's "Witchcraft." The moment looked crafted to send a clear message that two icons could share the spotlight, blending both worlds in a way no one had thought possible. Newspapers described it as a truce and a sign of unity. Fans who had once felt divided could suddenly see the two legends working together, even if only for a short time. The image of them smiling and trading songs painted a picture of mutual respect, as though the rivalry had ended. Yet behind the scenes, the story carried more complexity. While the cameras captured warmth and friendship, the move also served business purposes. Sinatra's show gained huge attention from Elvis's appearance, while Elvis showed himself willing to step into the mainstream world that had once rejected him. Both men gained from the partnership, even if their differences had not truly disappeared. The performance stood as a marker in how audiences remembered their relationship. What had started as harsh words and cultural tension shifted into a moment of staged harmony. However, there's more to the story. Finding a common ground, Sinatra's team felt uneasy from the very beginning about the television special. Tension had started to build around the way the show was promoted and the question of who deserved top billing. Elvis, with his explosive fame and magnetic presence, was paid an extraordinary sum of $125,000 for just a short appearance. This was far more than what Sinatra himself was receiving. That imbalance caused frustration and stirred irritation among Sinatra and those closest to him. Elvis did not arrive alone. Around him moved the Memphis Mafia, his close group of companions who always stayed nearby and protected him from outsiders. They studied Sinatra's actions carefully. To them, his sudden friendliness did not come across as sincere. They felt it was not born out of respect but out of strategy. Sinatra, they believed, saw Elvis as a path to remain culturally important. By standing next to the most popular rock and roll figure of the time, Sinatra could hold on to his relevance in a rapidly changing music scene. The idea seemed simple. If Sinatra could not defeat Elvis in popularity, he could at least bring him on stage and share the glow of his star. Elvis, always respectful and professional, behaved with grace during the broadcast. However, deep inside, he kept his guard up. He had not forgotten the harsh criticism that Sinatra had spoken years before about rock and roll. That memory never faded, even if outwardly he offered smiles and warmth. The two men stood side by side and delivered a performance that had been carefully rehearsed. Every movement, every smile, and every line seemed designed to create the image of unity. On the surface, it looked like two generations of music had come together. But those who watched closely could notice subtle signs. It was a performance meant to heal old wounds, yet to the audience it seemed too smooth, almost staged. When the show aired, newspapers praised it. Headlines celebrated the union of the old guard and the new. But behind the curtain, the mood was very different. Whispers spread through the industry. Insiders suggested that Sinatra had used the event to his advantage, borrowing Elvis's popularity to refresh his own image. Rumors spread that when the cameras turned off, the two stars barely spoke to one another. Many believed Elvis had not forgiven the earlier insults so easily. Still, the special went down as a historic moment in American entertainment. It marked an apparent meeting of eras, the swing of Sinatra and the rock of Elvis. To the fans, however, the rivalry lingered beneath the surface, unresolved but carefully hidden under layers of Hollywood gloss. For years afterward, the relationship remained one of public politeness, with suspicion never fully disappearing. Audiences accepted the image of professional respect, though most assumed the bitterness had never truly gone away. Time carried on, and the years turned the rivalry into part of show business history. But the story took a heavy turn on August 16, 1977. That morning, Elvis Presley was discovered unresponsive in the bathroom of his Graceland home in Memphis. He was only 42 years old. At that moment, the world seemed to stop at once. News of his passing traveled fast, striking with the force of a sudden thunderclap. Within minutes, disbelief spread everywhere. Crowds gathered outside Graceland, shocked and heartbroken. Radio stations rushed to confirm what was going on. Television networks raced to cover the tragedy. Fans wept openly in the streets, unable to take in the reality that the king of rock and roll was gone. His songs poured from radios across the world, and tribute specials were quickly prepared. For many, it felt like more than just the loss of one man. It felt like an era itself had ended. The shock was especially strong because Elvis had always seemed strong. Though his health had been questioned for years, with weight changes and unusual behaviors, the idea of his sudden demise still seemed unthinkable. Talks about prescription pills use and long stretches of isolation had been discussed quietly, but fans clung to the belief that Elvis would always endure. He had been almost eternal in the eyes of his audience. And then within a single morning, that image was shattered. Meanwhile, as grief swept across the globe, one name kept surfacing in the conversation: Frank Sinatra. The public and the media turned their attention toward him, the other great figure of American music, the man whose path had crossed with Elvis's in both conflict and collaboration. Now, with Elvis gone, many wondered what Sinatra would do next. The eyes of the world shifted toward him, waiting to see how he would respond to the sudden absence of the rival who had once challenged his throne, and then, reluctantly, shared his stage. The special that had once seemed like a carefully arranged truce was now remembered as one of the last major cultural moments where the two giants appeared together, even if the friendship behind it was never as genuine as it looked. What remained was a memory of staged unity, a performance frozen in time, and the sense that beneath the polished smiles, the distance between Sinatra and Elvis had never truly disappeared. However, it wasn't long before Sinatra finally spoke the truth. Frank Sinatra finally opens up. Frank Sinatra was known for his sharp voice, his strong opinions, and the power he carried in every room he walked into. Yet when the shocking news of Elvis Presley's passing spread across the world, Sinatra chose not to say anything at all. Days went by and he kept himself away from the public eye. People remembered how their history had been filled with rough moments, starting with criticism and later turning into a truce. The world wanted to see what Sinatra would do, but he stayed back. Newspapers and magazines filled the gap with their own stories. They pushed out theories, each one painting a different picture. Some writers claimed Sinatra had been moved and was mourning privately. Others argued that he felt nothing, that the tension between the two men had run too deep for him to pretend otherwise. While the public debated, Sinatra himself remained out of view. Behind closed doors, however, things were not as distant as they seemed. Those who stayed close to him during those days later explained that the news hit him harder than many would ever imagine. He spent the evening sitting alone, pouring himself a drink and staring into space. He stayed still, letting the weight of the loss sink in. For those who knew him best, that was the clearest sign of what he truly felt. He had always carried himself with control and confidence, but moments like these revealed his feelings without him ever needing to speak. There was no outburst, no loud display, just a man reflecting on someone who had left a deep mark on music and, in his own way, on him as well. Yet the public remained restless. They were still waiting, still holding on to see whether Sinatra would ever break his silence. The world had just lost one of its brightest stars, and people looked toward another legend to say something that might capture what they all felt. On August 17, 1977, that moment finally came. Just one day after Elvis Presley's demise, Sinatra stepped onto the stage at the Alpine Valley Music Theater in Wisconsin. The night had been planned as another performance, but what unfolded became unforgettable. Known for guarding his thoughts and keeping his emotions off stage, Sinatra surprised everyone that evening. As the band played softly, he stopped and faced the audience. A wave of stillness swept over the theater. Then, in words shaped by grief, he acknowledged the loss. He spoke about Elvis not as a rival, not as a symbol, but as a man. He called him kind, good-hearted, and deeply decent. Those words broke through years of speculation and rumor. The audience froze, taking in something they never expected to hear. That short tribute carried no envy, no casual politeness. It was filled with real sorrow, the type that cannot be staged. The crowd reacted in different ways. Some clapped suddenly, some wiped away tears, and others simply sat stunned. What mattered most was that Sinatra had finally spoken, and when he did, it was not about fame or numbers or competition. It was about respect. The moment was not shaped by managers or press agents. It was raw, spoken directly from one legend to another. When Sinatra finished, his voice shook slightly. Then, almost as if nothing had happened, he moved on with the show. But the audience knew they had just witnessed something rare. That tribute lingered in the air long after the music started again. Many would remember it as the most powerful part of the evening. For once, Frank Sinatra had set aside the polished image, and the world saw the true depth of his feelings. That night made clear that the bond between the two men was far more layered than the headlines suggested. The rivalry that tabloids loved to write about had always been a surface story. Those who had been close to them through the years often shared a very different view, one where admiration quietly existed behind the scenes. On that stage in Wisconsin, the truth finally slipped out for the world to hear. For Sinatra, Elvis was not just another figure in music. He was someone who had shaped culture in ways that few could match. Someone whose presence stretched across generations. And for all the differences in style and background, Sinatra recognized that. That recognition made the tribute not just about loss, but about connection. It stood as proof that beneath the hard image, beneath the pride and distance, Sinatra felt the loss deeply. In the years that followed, the image of Sinatra speaking that night remained strong. It revealed a side of him that the world rarely saw. It showed that even the strongest voices can break when faced with loss. In that brief exchange between memory and tribute, the real bond between Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley was finally uncovered, and it was far more human than anyone expected. An unseen connection. Elvis Presley was often shown to the world as a wild star who lived without limits, but the man away from the stage was very different. Away from the spotlight, he carried himself in a softer way. He treated people with care, showing kindness in moments when no one expected it. Those who were close to him noticed that he was polite, giving, and never driven by arrogance. Even Frank Sinatra, who could be sharp and fiery, recognized this side of him. Elvis carried himself with a gentle strength that stayed with anyone who spent time with him. Elvis held a deep respect for the older performers who had come before him. He never forgot how they had opened doors for singers like him. Sinatra, with his long career filled with reinvention, was one of those figures. Elvis looked up to the way Frank built his own path, took control of his music, chose his film roles, and even ran his own label. These were things Elvis admired, especially since he often struggled with his management and the choices made for his career. On the other side, Sinatra had his own strong personality. He could speak his mind without hesitation, and people around him often felt the weight of his opinions. Yet even he could not ignore Elvis's natural warmth. Despite their age difference and the distance between their social circles, Sinatra began to look past the flashy image and saw the person beneath. What he found was a man who cared deeply about others. Elvis was known for standing by his family and for being generous to strangers he had just met. He also protected his circle, the Memphis Mafia, with an almost fierce devotion. This way of caring for his people mirrored Sinatra's own approach. Frank also kept his friends close and made sure to look out for them. This shared trait created a bridge between the two men. Their paths did not cross often. There were no long nights of parties together or grand tours with both names on the posters, yet whenever they did meet, there was no actual tension. The 1960s Welcome Home Elvis special was a moment where their worlds joined, And although negotiations took place behind the scenes, the atmosphere was more about respect than rivalry. Ego played its part, as it always did in show business, but there was also a sense of recognition between them. Both men carried the heavy weight of fame. They knew what it meant to stand in the center of the spotlight, to feel the highs of adoration and the lows of loneliness. They had both faced endless judgment from the public eye. For that reason, they understood each other in ways few could. Sinatra may have been shaped by swing and jazz, while Elvis brought rock and roll to the front. But at the core, they were two men living with the same kind of pressures. Over time, Sinatra's view of Elvis grew even more respectful. He had seen Elvis change from a controversial newcomer into a global figure who handled fame with dignity. When Frank finally stood on that stage in Alpine Valley after Elvis had passed, his tribute revealed what many had missed. It was not crafted to win applause. It was an honest glimpse into how he truly saw Elvis, not as a rival, but as a kind man who cared for others. That tribute cut through the long years of rumors about conflict. It showed the world that there had been no deep divide, only connection that had grown quietly in the background. Sinatra was not one to give out such words easily, and when he spoke, people listened. It carried weight because it came from someone known for being guarded. The media had once built stories of competition between them, painting Elvis and Sinatra as symbols of different eras locked in opposition. But Frank's tribute forced a new look at their relationship. It turned the story from rivalry into one of respect. It reminded people that Elvis was not just a performer with wild moves on stage, but also a son, a friend, and a man who thought about others. This moment reshaped how Elvis was remembered in the years that followed. Fans began to see him through the lens of respect rather than comparison. They saw how two icons could stand for different versions of the American dream, yet still admire each other. Sinatra's words made it clear that admiration existed between them, even when it was not visible to the public. When Sinatra passed away in 1998, more than 2 decades after Elvis, his long career was remembered for many things. Yet the Alpine Valley tribute stood out as one of his rarest moments of openness. Fans still speak of it, wishing to hear the recording again, not only to confirm the lack of rivalry, but also to hold on to the rare moment of honesty shared between legends. What made it powerful was how it brought their stories together. The connection between them now lives on, not as a tale of competition, but as one of mutual respect. In the end, one man honored another, and in doing so revealed how two giants of different generations could still understand each other. The spotlight had once tried to frame them as rivals, but history now remembers them as two artists who carried the weight of fame and recognized humanity in one another. Do you think the connection between Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley was genuine? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.